In this video, we're going to go through an example of finding the domain and range in context. We're given a table, a graph, and an equation for a function r of p. It tells us that this function r of p tells us the total revenue in dollars when the p is representing the price that they charge per item. So notice that this means they're plugging in P, price per item, and it outputs R of P, the revenue they make. So part A here is asking us to first go ahead and label the meaning along the horizontal and vertical axis. As we said above, P is the input and R of P is the output. P represents price per item. R of P represents total revenue earned. In Excel, if you click on the graph and hit the plus sign, axes titles, it'll create text boxes that you can edit and label each axis. Next, it asks us to identify the domain and range in context. Now notice it already has an input-output table and graph with the main important points on this function labeled. So for example, in red, in the table is the point 0, 0, which is both a y-intercept and an x-intercept. In red on the graph, we see that point here. So that's telling us when they charge $0 per item, they will have a revenue of $0. In blue, in the table, we have this point 1500, 9 million, also labeled on this parabola, and you'll see that that point appears to be the peak point. It's called the vertex of this graph, the peak point, the highest point. It's saying when they sell the items at $1,500 per item, the revenue total will be highest at $9 million total revenue. And lastly, in green, here on the table, here on the graph is another horizontal intercept. It says when they charge as high as $3,000 per item, their revenue by that point will be 0. It must mean their price is so high nobody's buying them anymore. So first thing I did there to think about finding domain and range in context was I identified the meaning of the input and output variables, right? And I labeled them. I then labeled some important points on the graph to make sure I'm clear on the meaning of the points. And next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to think about the domain of this function in reality. Domain, the input values that we can plug in. So in context, we're talking about the values of P we can plug in. The values of the price. It means which prices make sense in reality. So the lowest value of P that makes sense in reality would be $0 per item. You couldn't charge any less than $0 per item. You certainly couldn't charge negative value. So anything below P equals 0 does not make sense in reality. The point 0, 0 is the very first point on the left that we can consider as making sense in reality. Any values below P equals 0 do not make sense in reality. So our domain is going to start at P equals 0. The highest value of P that makes sense in context. So let's take a look at this graph and table. So starting at P equals 0, that price makes sense. You could, if you wanted to, give away the items for free. You could also charge, $10, $50, $500, $1,000 an item, and higher and higher and higher. But notice we actually need to stop here at a price of $3,000. That's the highest price that makes sense in reality. The reason I know that is because at $3,000 per item, they will have a revenue of $0. If you charge any more than that, you will have negative revenue. And your revenue can't be negative. Revenue is cash in hand. It's not profit, it's revenue. Revenue cannot be negative. So the lowest the revenue can go is 0. So we cannot charge more than $3,000 per item. So now we know the domain in context is the values of P that span from $0 per item up to $3,000 per item. Next, let's think about the range. The range is the set of output values that make sense in context, the Y values that make sense in context. So we have already decided that we can't plug in P values below P equals 0. We can't plug in P's above 3,000. So what Y values do we get out? Well, we get out Y values, output values, R of P values, starting at a low of 0 and spanning up to a peak of 9 million. Those are the highest and lowest values of revenue we can attain. A low of 0 to a high of 9 million. The domain in context is the R from 0 to 9 million. So with this function, the only values of revenue you could possibly get are revenue values from $0 up to revenue values of $9 million.